Well, hi guys and welcome. This is Stuart and welcome to this month's success tip. Today I'm going to talk to you about inflation and a new word you may not have heard called shrinkflation. Headline inflation says, inflation's running at 2% a year, or at least that's what the target is of most central banks around the world. Now, inflation is the rate of, it's actually an expansion of the money supply, but inflation is prices rising every year. And they tell you it's good for the economy. First up, I'm going to talk to you about shrinkflation, then we'll come back to inflation. So, with this, I need to go to my trusty treat breakfast on occasion, this beautiful product. This product is not cheap. It's a superfood breakfast cereal and it costs around $16.95 where I buy it for 500 grams. Not cheap, but beautiful stuff. Now, here's an interesting thing. I've been sitting on this for over 9 months because I didn't know whether to tell you this or not. But I went into the store once, didn't notice any difference, and boom, here was the new box. Can you see the difference? Let me show you. Yes, one's 500 grams, one is 400 grams, but guess what happened to the price? Nothing. It stayed the same, $16.95. Now, no one even noticed. They just thought it was new packaging. See how sly they've done? Change the packaging so no one would notice. Hey, but I'm a consumer. I noticed. Same dollars, smaller box. The shop owners didn't even notice. Now, what has this done? This has broken my trust. Ladies and gentlemen, transaction relies on trust. The currency of business or transactions is trust. You break someone's trust and loyalty, you are done. Now, I like what Napoleon Hill said. His number one characteristic for a mastermind team member was honesty and loyalty. And he said, if someone doesn't give honesty and loyalty to those who they owe it to, they are lower than the dust of the earth. And I wholeheartedly concur. And you know what? That little incident has broken my trust in that brand and that product. And I haven't bought it since that time. You see, ladies and gentlemen, all of the profit is in the long-term relationship with your client or customer. Case in point. That is called shrinkflation, where they tell you inflation's running at 2% and nothing changes, but you're paying the same amount of money, but guess what? I just got 20% less goods in my product. So this is a way where inflation is virtually hidden from us. Not that that product would be included in how they calculate normal standard inflation, Now, in the States, they've got a thing called core CPI or core inflation. And I found out it doesn't even include fuel or food. Now, isn't that what inflation's meant to measure, or the CPI, the cost of living every year? What's more fundamental to people than food and fuel in their day-to-day lives? I don't know. But who was it one time said there's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics? Fair enough. So let's now talk about inflation. Central banks around the world generally are targeting a 2% inflation rate. Now, what is inflation? Inflation is an expansion of the money supply. Now, do you know, I read a statistic that said inflation prior to the 1800s was running at 1% per century. Per 100 years, inflation, it was negligible, didn't even exist. Prices didn't rise over centuries. Now they rise every few months, or they're aiming for 2% a year, but even that I think is a little bit dodgy the way they're measuring that. So they say this is good for the economy. Tell me, who is inflation good for? Is it good for the consumer, that you pay more every single year? I don't think so. I can't see that's good. There's less money for you to spend on other stuff if that's rising. In Venezuela right now, 185% inflation. Now, this year, the figure's not in yet. They reckon it's 500% inflation. These are IMF figures, and they're predicting 200% inflation in the next 12 months. That means if you bought an apple for $1 today, in 12 months, you're going to be paying $20 for that apple. Their economy is in free fall. The people are in desperate poverty, and it is just going to the dogs. I was going to say that, well, figuratively, they are. I hear reports of killing domestic animals in the streets for food, which is just a real shame for a mismanaged economy and a corrupt, probably central government there as well. Not that they aren't all, but that's a different question. So inflation, is it good for the business owner? Prices go up 2%? Sure, if the business owner can charge 2% more and keep their costs current, they make more money, right? Or even drop their costs. But that's not the case either, is it? Why? Because the second they put their prices up, the competition will get more market share and they'll get less money. Or if the competition can do it cheaper, they'll make more money. So it's not even good for business. So who is it good for? Well, the only answer left is central banks and governments. Why is it good for governments? Well, governments rack up all this money and debt making these promises to people to buy votes. You vote for me, I'll give you an ice cream every Sunday. So these people vote for them, and then they're obligated to give them an ice cream every Sunday. And this is just how the game goes. Now, if you bought a house in the 1970s in Sydney, you might have paid 100 grand for it. That property today might be worth 1.5 million, might even be worth 2 million. That is also a measure of inflation. So right now we've got a new, well, we don't, but the state has President Trump just elected, and he's inherited a $20 trillion debt that no one's talking about. They're going to be shortly, let me tell you. They will either default honestly or they will default dishonestly. Now, chances are they're probably going to try and inflate the debt away. What does that mean? Well, again, the 20 trillion now looks massive and it's enormous. They'll never pay it back. But it's just like the $100,000 debt on for a Sydney home 40 years ago. You know, 40 years later, that 100,000 looks small compared to the 1.52 million it is today. And that's what they're going to try and do with the 20 trillion. And how they're going to do that? The only way is to expand the money supply. They're going to print like the clappers, like there's no tomorrow. They're going to put QE 1, 2 and 3 to shame. They're going to put the Bank of Japan and the EU to shame in their money printing exercises, potentially to inflate the money supply to do away with this debt. So, here's the punchline and why I wanted you to stay all the way through to this. What has stayed traditionally above inflation? What asset class? Well, John Lindemann, famed Australian researcher, you can see him at our UPCC events this year. John says that well-selected property in Australia has tracked about 3% above inflation year on, year out. Now, not always it changes that, but over 3% above inflation. So, if you want some insurance against what's being done to your money supply, you might want to find well-selected property and buy very, very well. Anyway, also some benefits to being in a hard physical bricks and mortar asset as opposed to a digital one, but maybe we'll touch on that next time. So that's it for now. I hope you now know what shrinkflation is and how it disappears before your eyes, and a little bit more about inflation. And until next time, to your success.